Welcome to Fort Larned National Historic Site. The fort was an important military post along the Santa Fe Trail, which cut through Kansas on its way to Santa Fe, New Mexico. This site is operated by the National Park Service and is open most days of the year and is free of charge. I began my day at the Visitor Center, which has a museum with artifacts from the fort and history about the fort and the Santa Fe Trail. In the Visitor Center, you will also find a gift shop with books on the history of Fort Larned, restrooms, and some fun souvenirs for the young and old alike. If you travel with a National Park Service passport book, you can stamp that here as well to add to your collection from across the country. I had not toured the fort since I was a kid, and I was very excited to visit this beautifully preserved piece of Kansas history. Next, I decided to visit the barracks where the soldiers lived. This room housed a company of 80 men in very tight quarters. The two barracks buildings were designed to hold 4 companies in total. The soldiers were required to sleep 4 per bunk, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. The men slept head to foot. Bathing was a little more challenging back then, and as such, they were only required to wash their feet once every 3 days and to take a bath once every 7 days. After leaving the barracks, I visited the hospital, which is just a short walk under the shade-covered porch. This is an indoor outhouse, if you will. The sick patients could quickly get to the restroom when needed without heading outside in the dark of the night. Also seen here is a bathtub.
The wounds would get changed daily, sometimes more than that, depending on how much blood there was. Um, and they would take the bloody, dirty gauze, something like that, and wash it and reuse it, of all things.
As they had less soldiers here, it was converted to a hospital. Their original hospital was an adobe building out back. And you can still see the foundations. But believe it or not, Kansas is too wet for adobe. I know, hard to believe, but it is. And so they converted this half of the building into, instead of from this barracks into a hospital. This kitchen would have probably had slightly better quality food, because a lot of the people that ended up in the hospital was a lot to do with the cooks were soldiers done in rotation, whether they knew how to cook or not. And so there were a lot of mishaps, let's just say, that caused digestive issues. And so this one, if they had anything fresh or something like that, they might use it in here. The idea is to get them back on the feet doing their job, because they don't pay soldiers to lay in bed being sick. So, would have likely been soldiers in here cooking too, possibly hospital matron. A lot of what we're cooking today, probably a little bit better quality, more along the lines of what you might see on Officer Pro. And we try to stick to what was available. But honestly, Santa Fe Trail brought down a lot of things. Canned goods, fruit, vegetables, things that travel well, apples, cabbages, things like that. Lemons or lemon crystals, right. Believe it or not. We have lemonade here, and they did have lemon crystals at the time.
All frontier forts at that time were ordered to have vegetable gardens. And so assuming they were able to get a good harvest during the summer, the soldiers had access to fresh vegetables. They grew corn, beans, radishes, lettuce, squash, all sorts of vegetables. And the gardens at Fort Larned were just to the north of the fort, and they were quite large because the list of vegetables that somebody's cattle destroyed runs to bushels of this and bushels of that.
To the east of the main fort complex, you will find the location of the original post cemetery. After the fort was decommissioned, the bodies of the soldiers were exhumed and relocated to Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery. Next, I visited the shops building, which included the bakery and blacksmith.
Do 8 loaves in a pan. They're about 18-ounce loaves.
Even though fresh bread was made daily, Army doctors of this time period did not have a complete understanding of the yeast that was used to make bread. They were concerned that the yeast might be dangerous to eat, even after baking. It was required that all loaves of bread were to be stored for a minimum of 48 hours before they were given to the soldiers.
Ration of bread for a soldier was 1 18-ounce loaf of every day. 1 18-ounce loaf every day. So, if we have 300 soldiers here, I'd need to do 300 loaves every day. 8 in a pan. A lot of pans of bread. Coals and everything, and rake them from the oven into the firebox. And then I maintain the heat from the firebox. So once it's heated up, I can just maintain it from here, keeping it at somewhere between 350 and 400 degrees.
The blacksmith was skilled at fixing all kinds of parts and pieces of items that were needed to go about daily life. He did not typically make horseshoes, as those were commercially made elsewhere in large quantities. For the most part, his skills were needed to fix wagons and wagon wheels, as those were necessary items for hauling goods to and from the fort by both the Army and civilians traveling along the Santa Fe Trail. During my visit, he was making small chains for the kids to take home as a souvenir. When I visited as a kid, the blacksmith made me a really cool little hook that I used to hang my belt from. From the smell of burning coal to the sound of a hammer striking the hot steel, I could watch him work for hours. It is a very impressive skill to heat and forge iron. The blacksmiths of that era were indeed very talented people. I continued my tour at the new commissary building. This room was used as a schoolroom for the children and a library for the soldiers when they were off duty.
You're not bringing your feet together, you were just extra long steps. So take your hands step back. Be in line with each other. Retreat is the same thing but with your rear foot. Retreat. Advance.
This is the blockhouse that was initially built to help secure the fort. The slits in the walls are for rifles, and the men could defend themselves on both upper and lower levels. There is also a water well and passageway below the floorboards. In later years, the blockhouse was used as a guardhouse and jail. On the south side of the fort, you will find the old commissary building and the quartermaster storehouse. These buildings held weapons, food, and other supplies that were needed for life on the frontier.
There was an Indian agency established here during the Civil War, and Colonel Jesse Leavenworth was the Indian agent. And he had formerly been the commander here of the post earlier in the war. But his job was to negotiate and deal with the different tribes. He was the agent for the Comanches, the Kiowas, and the Prairie Apaches. And he did not speak their language, but he was able to communicate with them because he was fluent in sign language. So he had a lot of different tasks to deal with here. One of them was to ransom white children or other captives who had been captured by the Comanches and the Kiowas on different raids that they made on individual ranches. So he had to go down to the different villages and talk and negotiate and offer ransom for these captives. So the annuity goods that he had in storage were part of the things that he used for ransom, sugar, coffee, salt, and other commodities he would give to them in exchange for the people who had been captured.
The buildings at Fort Larned were initially constructed out of adobe. This was not a long-term solution. However, it provided a quick shelter from the elements. As the fort grew in size, the buildings were made out of sandstone blocks that were quarried at a site along the Pawnee River, approximately 2 miles to the east. I finished my visit today at the officers' quarters. These buildings face east toward a fantastic sunrise view of the parade grounds. What a sight this must have been to look out every day onto the bustling grounds of Fort Larned. Each of these buildings housed 2 captains and 4 lieutenants. Living in the officers' quarters was, of course, a benefit due to the additional responsibilities of leadership. This looks like a pretty nice way to live out on the frontier. As I film this in late spring, you can see tomatoes and other vegetables that would have been grown when the fort was active. This garden, behind the officers' quarters, was one of several larger gardens that were located here. As I learned earlier in the day, it was a requirement by the Army for them to grow as much of their own fresh food as possible to help prevent disease and ailments like scurvy. The fort had cattle for fresh beef. However, everything else had to be hauled in from other locations. It would have been a treat for everyone living here to have fresh vegetables from the garden through the summer and fall. I have had an amazing time here, and I highly recommend that if you are from Kansas, or if you are just passing through, that you take some time to visit this incredible piece of Kansas history.